Imagine this. You're 25 years old. You work a dangerous but respectable job on the railroad. One day, you're packing blasting powder into a hole with a long metal rod, and in a blink of the eye, the powder ignites. The iron rod, over 3 feet long and over an inch thick, shoots like a missile straight through your skull, in through your cheek, and out through the top of your head. And somehow, you don't die. You stand up, you talk, you walk. But over the few weeks that follow, something changes. People say you're not the same man you once were. Not just your body, not at all, but your mind. Your story will echo through medicine, neuroscience, psychology, and even pop culture. You become the most famous railroad foreman in the history of human thought. This is the story of Phineas Gage. I'm Aaron Baker, and you're listening to Way Out of History, where we dig up the strangest, wildest, and most thought-provoking true stories from the past, and we even share personal testimonies of those who have a new life in Christ. Today's story: a man survives an accident no one should have walked away from, but what he lost just might have very well been himself. Before the accident, Phineas Gage was by all accounts a respectable man. The year is in 1848. The railroad is fast growing and considered to be the next big thing of its time, connecting towns, driving expansion, changing everything. Gage was a foreman with the Rutland and Burlington Railroad in Vermont. He was known to be a hard-working, capable, well-liked by the men who worked under him, and trusted the company he worked for. He was strong, punctual, and most importantly, cool-headed. In a job that involved managing dangerous explosives, you need somebody cool and level-headed, and that was Gage. And he was actually in Cavendish, Vermont, one September afternoon preparing a rock cut. The job? Drill a hole, pour blasting powder, insert a fuse, and tamp it down with an iron rod. Simple, standard, nothing out of the ordinary. But that day, someone forgot a critical step: inserting the sand. Normally, sand would be poured into the hole before tamping to prevent the sparks. Instead, the rock struck metal on stone, a spark, an explosion. The tamping rod, 43 inches long and weighing 13 pounds, rocketed upward, straight through Gage's left cheek, behind his left eye, and out the top of his skull, landing dozens of feet away, covered in blood. He was thrown black. Everyone thought he was dead, but Phineas Gage, to their surprise, got up. He sat upright in the ox cart on the way to town. He walked into the doctor's office, and then he said these words: "Here's some business for you." Dr. Harlow was the attending physician. He kept detailed notes, and thank God for that, because his accounts remains one of the most astonishing medical reports in history. When Harlow arrived, Gage was sitting in a chair, vomiting. Each time he leaned forward, a portion of the rod visibly protruded from his skull, and still, he could speak, and he could answer questions. Now let's make one thing clear. The iron rod had blown away his left frontal lobe. That's the part of the brain that deals with personalities, decision-making, emotional regulation, and social behavior. The wound festered. Gage developed a fungal infection. At one point, Harlow removed necrotic brain tissue. Gage was delirious for weeks, but then, to their surprise, he slowly recovered. He could walk, he could talk, see, eat, but people started noticing something, that he wasn't quite right. Friends and coworkers started saying, Gage just isn't Gage anymore. Before the accident, he was calm, responsible, reliable. Afterward, he became impatient, irritable, profound. He couldn't stick to plans. He seemed indifferent to consequences. One friend described him as having no restraint, no respect for social conventions. His employers, who once considered him indispensable, wouldn't even hire him back. He drifted. He tried different jobs. a stagecoach driver in Chile, a living exhibit in Barnum's American Museum. Dr. Harlow wrote years later, the equilibrium between his intellectual facilities and animal propensities had been destroyed. This was one of the first clinical observations that damage to specific areas of the brain could change personality, not just physical ability, but the very essence of one's behavior. In effect, Phineas Gage had survived his injury, but lost parts of his social and moral self. Gage died in 1860 in San Francisco after a series of seizures, likely related to his injury. He was just 36 years old, but that wasn't the end. Years later, Dr. Harlow, still obsessed with the case, tracked down Gage's family. He requested and received permission to exhume Gage's remains. He took the skull and the tamping iron, which Gage had kept with him his whole life, and donated them to the Warren Anatomical Museum at the Harvard Medical School. And they're still there to this day. You can go see the rod that passed through a man's head that didn't kill him. You can see the skull that rewired the world's understanding of the brain. And in some way, it's like Phineas is still with us, watching, silently reminding us of how fragile and how astonishing our minds and our lives really are. Phineas Gage's story didn't end with the rod, or even with his death. In many ways, it was just the beginning, not just for science, but for how we understand ourselves. Let's just take a step back. It's the mid-1800s. Medicine is still closer to medieval than modern. Doctors don't have anesthesia. Germ theory is still being debated, and brain science? Well, it's practically a superstition. Back then, the prevailing idea was phrenology, the belief that you could read a person's character by the bumps on their skull. Sounds pretty wild today, I know, but back then, that was common practice. People thought your moral character, your intellect, your emotions, they all lived in little compartments on your head, like drawers in a cabinet. And if one drawer stuck out, well, that meant something. They didn't know what, but it meant something. Now here comes Phineas Gage, an actual person with a literal hole through his head, and he seems to prove a different point. Not that a bump means something, but real physical damage can alter behavior. Doctors and philosophers scrambled to make sense of it. Was the brain a machine? Or was it just separate part of the body? Science kept pointing that, it was just part of the body. And Gage became ground zero. Now let's get into the scientific aftermath of that. Over the next century, Gage's case was cited again and again in neurology, psychology, and even legal theory. The prefrontal cortex, a term that we now take for granted, was largely mapped out using insights that started with Phineas Gage. In fact, some of the first lobotomies, yes, those horrifying procedures where parts of the brain were destroyed to control behavior, were inspired by the early interpretations of Gage's injury. Surgeons in the 20th century thought, if damage to this area makes a man more docile, maybe we can replicate that on purpose. That led to the infamous experiments on psychiatric patients. Was that the right lesson? Well, obviously not. But Gage's case raised the question, how much personality is chemical? How much of it is mechanical? Can it be fixed? Should it? Now fast forward to the 21st century. We've got MRI machines, neurosurgery with robots, brain-computer interfaces, and still even neurology students, even psychology undergrad students, they all study Phineas Gage. They've scanned his skull, they've modeled the damage, and they've simulated the trajectory of the rod through his brain in 3D. And what they're learning is pretty astonishing. The rod traveled upward behind his left eye, through the prefrontal cortex, the area we now know is responsible for decision-making, moral reasoning, and emotional regulation. That's why he survived physically, but struggled socially. Now think about that for a minute. We often think of the self as a unified whole, but Gage shows us that the you in your head, that's a team effort. Different regions of the brain working together. Damage one node of that network, and everything can change. Now let's take a step back. Let's zoom out for a second. Today we see Gage's story play out in modern ways. Veterans returning from war with traumatic brain injuries, athletes suffering from repeated concussions, developing mood disorders, memory loss, aggression, stroke survivors relearning speech, personality shifting, Alzheimer's patients drifting away while their bodies remain. That one hits a little close to home. My grandmother. She has passed away now. She has gone to be with the Lord, had Alzheimer's. But all of these cases echo Gage, the idea that who we are is stored somehow in fragile biological circuits. But there's hope. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself. It's something Gage might have experienced without us even realizing it. When he moved to Chile and took that coaching job, he followed routines, managed responsibilities, interacted socially. Was that recovery? Adaption, or was he healing? I don't think we really will know for sure what happened, but what we do know this: he wasn't static. He wasn't just a damaged man. He was healing. Now, Phineas Gage is in pop culture and myths. In pop culture, Phineas Gage became kind of a symbol. You'll find him in textbooks, sure, but also in novels, TV shows, even video games. There's a band named after him. Several movies used his case as inspiration for characters who suffer a brain injury and come out different. In one sense, that's great. He's remembered. He goes on. But in another, it's a cautionary tale about how we reduce real people to symbols. The truth about Phineas Gage is more complex than he was good, then he was bad. He was more than a footnote. He was more than a case study. He was a human being, living through something no one else ever had. And that's where empathy comes in. Imagine waking up in a small town in 1848 with a hole in your head and realizing people look at you differently. Your friends drift away. You lose your job. You struggle to control your emotions, and no one understands why. In today's world, maybe Phineas Gage would have been in therapy. He might have had a support group. He might have been on medications. But in his world, he had a tamping iron through his head and the will to keep going. Well, this story reminds me of one that happened in my family. My great uncle took shrapnel to the head in a dynamite accident where he was blowing stumps. He survived and grew old and lived a full life. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't angry. He was exactly the same as he was before. Now, I can't compare him to Gage scientifically, but emotionally, spiritually, I probably can't compare them that way either. But they both force us to rethink what it means to be ourselves. We tend to believe that we're solid, unchangeable. But Gage reminds us personality isn't a fixed thing. But my uncle reminds us maybe it is. Sometimes the process gets interrupted and we just don't fully understand. We just have to know that God has a plan. Sometimes we have to reboot our lives. And sometimes we have to find a way to continue. That's the beauty of this story. It's not just about survival. It's not just about transformation. It's about going on. Is it for better or for worse? That's for you to decide. So, thanks for sticking with me on this deep dive into one of the weirdest and wildest, most eye-opening stories in not just history, but medical history. This has been Way Out of History, and today's episode was Mind Blown: The Incredible Survival and Strange Legacy of Phineas Gage. And boy, I tell you, it was a ride. If this story blew your mind, do me a favor, subscribe to the show, leave a review, share this episode with that one friend who loves history, science, and even medical novelties. And sometimes you can share it with a person that just likes a really, really unbelievable true story. If you got your own strange family legend or bizarre historical mystery you think I should cover, drop me a line at wayoutofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Join us next time as we cover more historic novelties. Until then, God bless, Jesus loves you, and have a great day.